This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting live from the UN Climate Summit in Bonn, Germany. The International Energy Agency predicts U.S. oil production is expected to grow at an unparalleled rate in the coming years, even as the majority of scientists worldwide are saying countries need to cut down on fossil fuel extraction, not accelerate it. Meanwhile, a group of 15,000 scientists have come together to issue a dire second notice to humanity, 25 years after a group of scientists issued the first notice warning the world about climate change. This comes as a major new study says European governments have drastically underestimated the methane emissions from gas. The report finds European Union nations can burn gas and other fossil fuels at the current rate for only 9 more years before these countries will have exhausted their share of the Earth's remaining carbon budget necessary to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, we're joined now by the co-author of that report, one of the world's leading climate scientists. He traveled here from England by train, refuses to fly, because of its massive carbon footprint. Kevin Anderson is Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research and Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester in Britain, co-author of the major new report entitled, Can the Climate Afford Europe's Gas Addiction? Kevin Anderson, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. So there's so much to talk about. First, you took a train here, not a plane.
Yes, I always try and travel either by train or by ship, often by container ship. It's not that I think the emissions necessarily for me or any other individual are in themselves really important, but I think it is really necessary for those of us who judge that climate change is a huge and serious issue that we demonstrate that in our own lives, and that we don't just demonstrate it in what we do, but we try and push that agenda more widely amongst our own colleagues, with our own universities, and then of course hopefully eventually that governments pick these things up and then scale up policies to drive this behavioural change at a national and then hopefully a global level.
You have coined the term the climate glitterati. What do you mean?
I think there have been, for many years, there have been people, the great and the good in the climate world, and they have certainly tried very hard to address the issues of climate change, though I think with the latest data we can see that emissions are going up even this year in 2017. So fundamentally they and the rest of us have actually failed in delivering what we expected or what we hoped for. But this particular group, I think, have done remarkably well out of the climate change world, if you like, out of all of these, the COPs, all the negotiations, the engagement with policymakers, the trips to Davos and so forth. And I think in doing that, in being part of the status quo, they've actually misunderstood that a significant part of the problem when it comes to climate change is making changes in how we live our lives today, particularly those of us who are the very high emitters. About 50% of global emissions just come from about 10% of the global population. And the climate glitterati are quite clearly, and I include myself there, are in that particular group. And we have to demonstrate leadership in what we do. And I think if people are going to take our very careful analysis seriously, then we have to lend that analysis credibility by demonstrating that we are adjusting our own lives accordingly.
You took pictures of the summit on Friday night?
Yeah, I did indeed, yes. Yeah, I was here at 10 o'clock. When it was virtually empty, I was still working on one of the computer clusters. And that all the computer screens were still on, that the main large screens were still running. And this is the Climate Change Conference, the 23rd Climate Change Conference. Now, I'm all in favour of the UNFCCC and the IPCC and these big organisations. They are really important and pivotal to climate change. But we must be surely by now demonstrating change in our own institutions.
I was talking to some Pacific warriors this morning as they rolled out the red carpet that said, keep it in the ground for Angela Merkel, who's speaking today. They were from Tonga and Samoa. And they said it's Fiji inside and Bonn outside, freezing cold outside and boiling inside.
Yeah, that's very much what it's like, yes, indeed. Yeah. It's also very bright inside as well with all the lights.
So can you talk about what David Banks said? This is President Trump's climate advisor.
Well, my take on what I heard there was he was very uncomfortable trying to defend the indefensible, really. I mean, he clearly was not happy with having to agree what the president has said on a number of occasions about climate change. Of course, his position, the president's positions, have changed on this quite considerably, as they have on other areas as well. I mean, I think at the end of the day that quite clearly the president and his advisor are reluctant to engage with anything coming from the science on climate change. So they are coming to climate change from a completely different perspective. Now, the science is almost an irrelevance. They're thinking of climate change much more in a short-term, narrow political sense.
So you had the Trump panel on Monday night. It was just astounding. Three-quarters of the room walked out in the middle singing a song, Proud to be an American, to a different lyric. And at the end of this panel, it was 4 corporate executives and someone from Pence's office and Trump's office. I got a chance to ask them a question. Democracy Now! NewsHour.
This is our last question before we have to wrap up.
Quick question, just a simple yes or no from each of you, whether you support President Trump pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord. If we could begin with Lenka.
I'm here for a reason, and that's to support climate change mitigation.
Just a quick, simple yes or no answer.
Well, the question was
whether you support President Trump pulling the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord.
No, I don't support it.
Ali?
I know you want yes or no, but our company's statement wasn't yes or no, so please just allow me to say what it is. We did not ever weigh in. There was reports actually that we weighed in both directions. Our opinion was that it's up to them. There's a lot to decide, but whether or not the U.S. is in the Paris Climate Agreement, we will continue to work on low emissions technologies for coal.
And you personally, Holly?
Gosh, I'm not really a policy person. I'm sorry, that was a cop-out. You're right. I personally, I'm not here to represent myself, so come talk to me afterwards.
Or no, are you for or against?
I'm not going to answer for my personal opinion.
Amos?
I think I have the easiest task. I don't think Dave or Francis expect me to say anything else. I work for the Obama administration. I supported the Paris agreements, fully thought it was a great achievement for the president.
Barry Worthington, yes or no?
There's actually 2 answers. The U.S. Energy Association did not take a position before the president pulled out of Paris. As soon as he pulled out of Paris, we issued a statement saying that he should renegotiate Paris. From my own personal standpoint, the answer is yes, because of the reasons I laid out.
You support Trump pulling the...
We're achieving the emissions reductions goals without having the regulatory burden. We're doing it for other reasons.
Francis Brooke.
Thanks, Barry. And now we're going to go to closing.
No, Francis,
from our
I'd like your response.
Can you? We're not
just
here.
2 more people. Simple question, just yes or no.
Takes 5 seconds.
I mean, pretty clearly, we both work for the administration, so that's who we're here to represent, and it's not going to change anything. So we're going to go
and
through
David
closing
Banks,
now.
your final question.
So we're going to start with
yes
Barry
or no?
Worthington. He's going to close for us.
David, any answer? I work for the President of the United States. So is it a yes or a no?
That was Trump's climate advisor, David Banks. Before that, Francis Brooke, policy aide in the office of Vice President Pence. Of the 4 corporate representatives pushing nuclear, gas, and coal, Lenka Kolkar of NewScale Energy and Amos Hochstein of Tellurian disagreed with Trump pulling the U.S. out of the climate agreement. Holly Krutka of Peabody wouldn't say, and Barry Worthington of the U.S. Energy Association agreed with President Trump. Interestingly, Trump's administration brings 4 corporate executives. 2 of them, half of them, disagree with him on this issue. But your response to what they said?
Again, I think they are primarily just trying to take a political line on this. They don't seem to be particularly engaged with the issues of climate change at hand. I get the impression they didn't really see it as a really very serious issue. That it was just a thorn in their side. They were uncomfortable trying to defend one position or the other. It's to some extent, I think it's reminiscent of what we've seen from the Trump administration. A lot of uncertainty, no clarity, and I would also argue, I think, a complete lack of innovative thinking. Because if they are genuinely concerned about the sorts of things that Trump said he was concerned about, things like jobs, I think the climate change agenda can quite easily be described as a jobs agenda. So there's plenty of employment in responding to the climate challenge in line with the Paris Agreement, but it requires a little bit more innovative thinking.
And what are those jobs?
Well, you think about it, I mean, the renewables industry itself requires lots of people working in it, but also we have to retrofit the existing infrastructure that we have in our society. If you look at the US, it's very high energy consumption. That needs to change rapidly. That means retrofitting buildings and properties, people's houses. It means much greater electrification of the energy system than we see today. There's just a huge amount of construction work, engineering work, design work. This is about really a 30-year jobs program for all of the industrialized parts of the world to transition from the very high carbon infrastructure we have now to the low carbon infrastructure of tomorrow. So in that sense, surely if his commitment to the Dust Belt was really a sincere one, and he had some innovative capacity, he would see that the climate change agenda is a jobs agenda for the people that voted for him.
Your thoughts on geoengineering, something that's also discussed here. First, what it means and what you think about it.
Well, let's be quite clear. There's geoengineering, and there's something else quite similar to that called negative emission technologies. The negative emission technologies are basically these technologies that we don't yet have that are designed hoped in the future to remove carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, sort of suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and at least that's addressing the real problem. Even though we don't have these technologies, then you liquefy that carbon dioxide and store it somewhere safely underground for a few hundred or a few thousand years. The geoengineering is to allow...
Are you for or against that?
I'm for us researching it, but I'm for us doing all of the mitigation, all of the carbon reductions, assuming it does not work. So yes to research, no to including it in our policies today. And the geoengineering one is actually, I think, much more dangerous in many respects, though, again, I think it's important to have a research program on it. But the geoengineering is saying, let's not really do quite so much on the mitigation. Let's rely on reflecting the sunlight back out, the sunlight and the heat back out into space. And therefore we can resolve the problem that way. And there are things like pumping sulfates into the stratosphere, rockets into the stratosphere to put sulfates there. They're putting enriching some of the oceans with iron to increase the uptake of the development of biomass, which absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But these things all interfere with sort of major global planetary systems that we don't fully understand. I think they're incredibly dangerous, but nevertheless, I think it's important to research those, but again, mitigate our emissions, reduce our emissions, assuming that they won't work either.
Finally, what effect does President Trump saying he's pulling the U.S. out of the climate agreement mean? You were critical of the climate agreement, and we just have 20 seconds for this part of our conversation, then we'll do part two.
There's a good part and there's a bad part. Pulling out sends a really bad signal, but in him pulling out, it has energized some other parts of the world to say, we will step in and do far more, including, of course, many U.S. mayors.
We're speaking with Kevin Anderson, the Zennström Professor of Climate Change Leadership at the Center for Environment and Development Studies, Uppsala University, also chair of the Energy and Climate Change at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at University of Manchester in Britain. We'll link to the report that he has co-authored. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alcoff. I'm Amy Goodman. We'll do part two as a web exclusive with Kevin. Worldwide are saying countries need to cut down on fossil fuel extraction, not accelerate it. Meanwhile, a group of 15,000 scientists have come together to issue a dire second notice to humanity, 25 years after a group of scientists issued the first notice warning the world about climate change, massive carbon footprint. Kevin Anderson is Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research and Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester in Britain, co-author of the major new report entitled, Can the Climate Afford Europe's Gas Addiction? Kevin Anderson, welcome back to Democracy. This comes as a major new study. It says European governments have drastically underestimated the methane emissions from gas. The report finds European Union nations can burn gas and other fossil fuels at the current rate for only 9 more years before these countries will have exhausted their share of the Earth's remaining carbon budget necessary to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, we're joined now by the co-author of that report, one of the world's leading climate scientists. He traveled here from England by train, refuses to fly because of its... This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting live from the UN Climate Summit in Bonn, Germany. The International Energy Agency predicts U.S. oil production is expected to grow at an unparalleled rate in the coming years, even as the majority of scientists worldwide